In this video, we're going to take a brief look at the input function, which allows us to get data from users. A classic example of input is the keyboard, right? We use keyboards to type information into our computer all the time, and that information is then processed in some way for some purpose. Another common example is our phone, right? We use our thumbs to interact with our phone or our fingers, and that input from our fingers is processed through a number of methods, right? First of all, it has to be processed on a haptic screen. The pressure that we use when we tap our phone or press on our phone is also considered. Depends on, maybe if you're on an iPhone, you want to move an app around, right? You hold your thumb down to do something. And that information is then processed by the phone and then used in whatever application you are presently interacting with. And then another one we don't maybe think about is something like Face ID, which I know is an Apple product, but anytime we use our face to authenticate something on our phone, that's an example of input as well. The image of our face or the analysis of our face performed by the phone's camera is another example of input. So these are all valid examples of input. There are thousands, if not millions, of examples of possible inputs that go into computer systems, temperatures, acceleration, all these things. There's so many examples, but we won't go into all those because we're really concerned about how we get input with Python. And the way we do that is with a function called the input function. The input function is pretty straightforward. We use the word input to call that function, and then we give it some kind of prompt, which we're going to tell the user what it is we want from them, right? So this prompt is basically asking a question of the user. An example would be, enter your first name. Obviously, we want the user to give us their first name. Another example would be like, ask me a question. Or what should I eat? These are questions that we actually interact with on computers all the time. Like Google, we often are asking Google questions, even though we don't phrase them as English questions. We're really asking Google to look something up, and we're often phrasing it in a way that it's kind of like a question. We also ask computers all the time, what should we eat, right? We Google what food places are near us so we can go grab a bite. We don't actually type in a response to, like, what should I eat, but ultimately we are inputting our responses to these questions in some form or fashion. So how do we actually take this input and use it for some purpose with Python? Where does the input go once we get it from the user? You might be thinking ahead and recognize that input, like many functions, has to have a place to store its returned value, right? So input returns a value, and that return value in this case is the user's response. The user's response. So let's take a look here. If I type in what should I eat, the computer holds onto that data through the input function, and it needs a place for it to go. So I can store it in a variable like user_resp, which is just a short way of saying user response, right? And then I can use that user's response at any point in the program for any purpose. In this case, presumably, I'm going to answer a question about what that person wants to eat. So let's take a look at our three questions here in some examples. We've got what should I eat, ask me a question, and enter your first name. We're going to look at some examples of how we would use those in a Python program. Let's get started with these three examples of using input. So the first one is pretty simple. We're just going to ask the user what their first name is. We'll have a variable called first name. That makes sense, right? And then the input function, got opening and closing parentheses, just like we do for any function. And then we'll ask the question, what is your first name? Notice how my question is a string. Okay, so the prompt that I put into my input function needs to be a string. And I'm also going to include this colon on the end. That's kind of just a nice readability convention that programmers could use to help the user understand that they are being prompted to answer this question. That's what that colon means. It's waiting for something. This is not the same as a colon for like an if-else statement. Don't get confused, right? This isn't a string, so it has no programmatic value at all. It's just in a string sitting there like a normal character, okay? So I've got my input function here. I'll run the code. Notice that when I go to type, there's no space between the colon, the question mark, and the first letter of my name. So it's all kind of stuck together there. And we'll look at a trick here in just a second to fix that problem. But if we say, what is your first name? I say Quincy. And then I type in first name here. I get the string Quincy. So first name is currently holding the value Quincy. If I print first name, I'll also get Quincy right after this, just like that. And I could say print first name plus Tennyson, and that's going to make my whole name. Okay, so to fix this little problem where everything's sort of stuck together, all I've got to do is add a space right after my colon. So you should do that on pretty much every input statement you write. Include that little space after the colon, or after the question, however you want to do it. So let's have the computer respond to a question. Now, we would have to do quite a bit of programming to make it respond to just about any question. That would take quite a while, and we're not writing a big artificial intelligence program today. So let's just stick with a basic something like user question will be ask me a question. And then we will simply print out the user's question, and we'll print out the computer's response, and that will just be I am not sure about that, because this computer has not been programmed to do anything more than take input at this point. So I'm going to comment this code out so it's not running anymore, and then we'll run our new input. Notice I've got my space there, so it looks a little prettier. Let's see, what is the meaning of life? And the computer responds, I am not sure about that. All right, we can run it again and see what am I thinking right now? He's not sure about that, or it is not sure about that either, okay? So that's another example. Now you could do a lot of stuff to make this more interesting, and that's kind of what we're going to do with our Magic 8-Ball program, as you'll see, is we're going to give it a series of responses that we could have the computer reply to the user with, which makes it far more interesting. The last one, let's do this. Let's write a little program that will give us some suggestions on what to eat. So the first thing I need is places to eat, or cuisines, I should say, is perhaps more apt. So we'll say Italian, American, Asian food, Mediterranean. There we go. We have a variety of cuisines represented there. And how can I create this sort of randomness that the computer is going to respond with when I ask it where should I eat? Well, that requires what's called a library. And we're going to have some separate discussion on what this is in lecture. But a library is a set of programming tools that isn't already included in every Python program we create. So to get that tool bag from outside our program, we need to do what's called importing. In order to import the random library, which has all these tools that I want to create a sense of randomness in my program, I'm going to say import random. It's pretty straightforward. This will give me access to a variety of new functions that I can use to create a sense of randomness. So in this case, I've got my cuisines, and then I'm going to say user question is, let's see, press, or actually we'll do this. We'll say user response is going to be press enter to get a food suggestion. So this is sort of the what should I eat question taken a little further. And then we will simply print out a random choice, pretty cool method, from cuisines. All right, and you can read this and probably figure out what's going to happen. Let's see what happens. I'll go ahead and comment this part out again. I'll run this code. Press enter to get a food suggestion. Press enter. So when I press enter on my keyboard, it tells me Asian food. Let's try it again. Now it's going to tell me Italian. And I can run this again. And I get Mediterranean. So it's giving me a random choice from cuisines each time. So that's the input function. We give the user a prompt. We return that value, the user's response, and store it in a variable so we can use it later. And then we can use that variable however we want to. We can use that data however we want to. Pretty straightforward. That's input.